floor to each and every one of them. I would like to ask Ambassador George Papadopoulos, the head of delegation and permanent observer of the EPLO at the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, who is the host of this event, to take the floor to welcome the people around. Thank you very much, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Mavrogiannis, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, and distinguished members of the panel. I'm going to be a bit repetitive. A warm welcome to all of you for honoring with your presence the EPLO event on the Global Rule of Law report on Africa. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us, fully aware of all other activities going on at the Palais and elsewhere. My thanks also go to the member states that co-sponsored this event. EPLO is the brainchild of a group of law professors, in particular of Professor Giuliano Amato and the director of EPLO, Professor Floraitis, who is sitting on my right, who is here with us today. It was an idea that came to life as a full-fledged international organization accredited to the UN and other international organizations after climbing a very steep hill with obstacles and bureaucratic procedures. The EPLO office in Geneva is no stranger to Africa. During the last 3 years, I've organized, participated as a panelist and moderator on several events regarding Western Africa and Sudan. I work closely with member states, members of the civil society, and the UN Secretariat. I've also traveled extensively in sub-Saharan Africa for meetings of the African Union and other conferences. In the year 2009, I was vice president of the Durban Review Conference, known as the UN Conference Against Racism. Before giving the floor to Professor Amato, I'm pleased to give the floor to a very special guest, Moratinos. Mr. Moratinos, United Nations Under-Secretary General, High Representative for the Alliance of Civilizations and of Islamophobia, for a brief statement. Mr. Moratinos, you have the floor.
Thank all the member states that are part of this institution, this entity that has been expanding, has been including new member states. It is true that have the European stamp, but it doesn't mean in the presentation of all the work and activities of April, you will see that the reason I'm here today, the reason we are working together with the United Nations Alliance of Civilization is because the vocation of EPLO is to enlarge and to understand the polarity, the multipolarity of today's real world. So it's for me a great honor to open this event, and I'm very happy that it's linked with the report for Africa. I have not been able to read the report. I hope that I will be able to read the report, but only the fact to have the report of Africa shows the interest of EPLO and the need to really change and look areas of cooperation where African countries, African institutions, African legal order will be able to really consolidate and reinforce their work. Let me start with a reference of two important statements from two important European personalities that have shocked me, struck me, disturbed me, but I think are very, very timely to share with you, to recall them to you, because you have, of course, also read them and listened to them. And I think for the meeting of today, it could be of certain inspiration for our work. The first statement was a few years ago. Unfortunately, well, he was a Spanish compatriot, high representative of the European Union foreign policy and security, a friend and my friend, Josep Borrell. He was addressing the European diplomats in Brussels, the EU diplomats. And he said, we, Europe, we are the garden, out of Europe is the jungle. He created a kind of earthquake. Of course, then he tried to explain, to really go back, to say that's out of context, but it was involuntary because I know Borrell, he's a very honest, a very professional, but what he was in the mood, in certain circles in Europe, is that we are the garden, the rest is the jungle. So that really disturbed me very deeply. Then there is a second statement of also, today still very high responsibility, the President of the European Commission, that few months ago, 1 month ago, 2 months ago, he said, well, we live in a world that they don't need the norms. They don't need the rules. We have to prepare ourselves to defend through security, military means. Immediately was also, what is the President of the European Commission said that we don't need rules. If the European Union, Mr. President, is rules, the treaties, the acquis communautaire, the international law. So immediately she also, no, I was not very well understood. It was something that I didn't want to say. Of course, we defend as Europeans the international legality, international law, but it was said. So why we are here? Because we all believe and EPLO defend and EPLO is working for reinforcing the legal primacy, the primacy of law, the rule of law, the legal order, international order, the regional order, the national order. And that is what you try to share with others. At the same time, you consider that you are not the garden and others are the jungle. No, you say that you have to work with the support of the Alliance of Civilization, the work you are doing with different member states all around the planet, to understand the other legal system, to see how you can base a common understanding about the rule of law, so important, because without rule of law, you cannot have democracy. Without rule of law, you cannot really reinforce democracy. But the experience of Europeans, that of course very important, I'm a European, I'm fully in favor of what the Europe we can approach, we can share, we can accompany, but we don't want to impose. We should not impose our point of view. So that is what I think we should try to concentrate today. The EPLO and United Nations Alliance of Civilization have been since already now 3 years working together. We have a MOU, how do you call it, Memorandum of Understanding. We have been inviting each other, EPLO invited me to address in the different fora, different initiatives, and we as Alliance of Civilization were inviting EPLO to address our global forum. They were in Cascais, in Portugal, and also in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. participating, sending this important message that to cooperate in rule of law between different countries, that reinforce the message of alliance of civilization. And of course, we are trying to be more specific. We are working with our dear Secretary General Spiros Frogiatis to really benefit of this new cooperation in trying to establish a campus in Africa, in Morocco, in order that you could have this exchange of views, this common experience on legal procedures together, bringing Europeans, Mediterranean, Africans together to prepare themselves for what is important to really establish this common ground on law and rules, on legality. So my dear friend, that's why we are here. And so I'm very honored that you give me this opportunity. You know, and President Amato and all the people, Andreas, Spiros, that you can count on us. We are only starting. I'm very encouraged by seeing the expanding in positive sense of the group. We have, of course, here today a lot of African countries, and good news, very good news. Africa is the continent of the present, the continent of the future. Everybody knows that when you are in the UN, but New York is amazing how you see the African representative taking a strong position in all the discussion and debate that we have in the multilateral system. So I'm very honored to be here and ready to continue our modest but important role. So there is only one word. The logo of the United Nations Alliance of Civilization is many culture, one humanity. We are one humanity that have to really create a platform to live together. And to live together means to have rules that have, acceptance by everybody, that are considered to be honored by everybody, and that are not imposed by one another. There is no garden and jungle, there is only one community. Sometimes it's green, sometimes it's desert, sometimes it's with mountains, sometimes it's the sea, but one humanity. And when this Artemis went to the moon, and they sent a picture of the Earth, the planet, so small, so fragile. You don't see borders. There is no borders from the planet. So we have to save the planet. But how to save the planet? Saving the humanity. Because you become all green and you save the planet, yes, but then if we are continue to kill each other, we don't respect law, there will be no possibility. The planet will survive, they will be very, very happy. They say finally the human beings have disappeared. They will breathe. No more human being trying to destroy. But what we will be ourselves? Where we will be as humans? So that is the strength of law. It's not la ley de la fuerza, no, the law of force is the force of law that have to be defended and reinforced. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez, for a very thoughtful statement. I now have the distinct pleasure of giving the floor to Professor Giuliano Amato, President, Global Rule of Law Commission, EPLO President Emeritus, Constitutional Court, and former Prime Minister of the Italian Republic. You have the floor, sir.
Well, I thank you all for being here today with us. What is fascinating about Africa is that you have the past, the present, and the future that somehow are conflicting with each other, with opposite trends and sometimes opposite values, but also they concur with each other, compete with each other in creating the dynamic I was referring to. Let me take one of the main features that the report outlines since its first pages, the role of customary law in Africa. There are negative aspects. Here too, you have competing forces inside the same factor. Because in customary law, gender is what it is. Women are second-class citizens. Women are the ones who cannot own land, who come second in some other legal matters. But at the same time, customary law is where the sense of community is preserved. The community courts that still exist on the basis of customary law are the courts that are teaching us reparative justice, based not on punishment, but on reconciliation, the aim of which is not deciding who is right and who is wrong, but recreating the condition of peace in that community. You only have in mind perhaps the experience of South Africa and the truth commissions that were organized there, but it's not the only example. You find it also in several countries, and this is a positive element today. You have, of course, the inheritance of historic supervening factors. Africa became partially Muslim from the 7th to the 14th century. And even the legacy of this presence is a mixed legacy. Again, here you find legal systems influenced by religious values according to which, again, women are second-class citizens. You have the legacy of the colonial powers. What we learn from our report is that, yes, there is over-centralization in Africa nowadays in several legal systems, but responsible for it is the colonial period, because the colonial powers had the only interest of keeping power centralized in order to have a better control of the communities they were governing. At the same time, one of the fruits of this experience has been something that you realize studying Africa today, the generalized belief that access to justice is an essential part of my future. Anybody. There is no other part of the world where access to justice is perceived as a sort of password to enter with my rights the community, to support the weakest ones in the community, to eliminate the distance between the marginal ones and those who are at the center. Another important feature that this report outlines is the relationship that is more and more intense between local communities and their states on the one side and the supranational African organization. The African Union that was created, as you know, at the beginning of the century on the basis of the pre-existing African organization, the African Union is becoming a remarkable supranational organization with its court, with its commissions, with its assembly, with its direct powers. And it is already experiencing directives and legal guidelines that produce an impact on national legislations and on national acts. I would say that nowadays the rule of law finds its unequivocal support in the African Union and in what the African Union does. And there are constitutional amendments at the level of member states that somehow are linked to the action that the Union is nowadays exercising. This is extremely important, you see, because one of the thesis on the future of the world that I personally share is the thesis according to which a world organized only around member states is a world doomed to anarchy. And even the multilateral organizations, such as the main one that is hosting us today, the UN, needs something more than almost 200 member states, needs regional organizations, needs that action of convergence, of reduction of distances that regional organizations can do. And this is what the African Union is now doing in Africa. The reports, I don't have the time to illustrate the report in its details. The reports has obviously the main elements around which measuring the compliance with the rule of law, separation of power, independence of the judiciary, access to justice, measures anti-corruption in relation to public administrations, legal certainty, and of course human rights. For each of these elements, the report indicates the failures and the possible remedies. Certainly, corruption is something that when it does exist, invades everything. It reduces the credibility of the executive, it reduces the independence of the judiciary. But it's not only there that you have problems also in other areas. And we indicate the problem and the solution. What is important for me here to underline is that the report is not the same as other reports that you have from other organizations that are using the standard of the professors in school. You pass, you fail, you fail, you pass, and this is all. No, we are not satisfied with it. Our report is the platform for opening a dialogue with the countries involved. We intend to be useful not to be the judges of the world, but to be a group that interacts with others in order to improve what can be improved. More important than the judgment is understanding where the problem lies and who can do what. Now, we are convinced that in Africa there are several actors that can play a positive role in improving the situation. I insist on the fact that despite, were I a woman, probably I wouldn't say so, but despite the unacceptable role that it gives to women, customary law is something that has to be preserved in the future because the sense of community that in many societies is nowadays disappearing is preserved and fostered by community institutions such as the ones that are based on customary law. On the opposite side, there is the supranational level that can do even more than what it is doing. And member states should connect more. There are 55 member states that are pleno jure members of the African Union, but only 5 of them, or 8, I don't remember, no, 8 perhaps, 8 of them that accept citizens going directly to the supranational court and receiving a judgment on their behalf that is mandatory for the involved state. We have to widen the area of the member states of the Union that accept the standing of their individual citizens. At the level of member states, much can be done. And there are states that are doing it, from Kenya to Algeria. Different countries have already demonstrated that they do something. Our Commission offers this report and intends to be useful also in the future to the Union and to the African states that will be willing to read the report, as you haven't done as yet. Read the report and say, okay, these guys can be useful to us. Just give us a call and we will be ready to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amato.
For many years, Miguel Angel, how many years? Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, and now in the Alliance of Civilization. And last year he received this new mission to fight against Islamophobia. So, and I mean, we couldn't have more relevant person to talk about the phenomena that we are facing. Just to add on what the ambassador was saying about Professor Giuliano Amato, twice Prime Minister of Italy, member and currently President Emeritus of the Constitutional Court of Italy, that among thousands of other things, Professor Amato was Vice President of the Commission for the Future of Europe, and you remember that this effort failed, and after that he presided over the processing group, very rightly called Amato Group, which took us and guided us to what is today the treaty we operate upon in the European Union, which is the Lisbon Treaty. So now, after these initial statements, the intervention by Mr. Moratinos and the keynote speech by Professor Amato, I just retain one element in order to put in front of you on one of the last things Professor Amato was alluding to, this need to have an osmosis between customary law and the notion of rule of law as encompassing the feeling, both objective and subjective, of fairness and justice, a feeling of fulfilling the social contract between the citizen and the institutions having always to be at the service of the citizen and at the service of right. Therefore, this is this constant va-et-vient, if you like, between the two notions that mobilizes the Global Rule of Law Commission, and we count on the interaction with all African countries, with all of you, in order to leave our mark on what is happening around the world. We will now, if you allow me, move to a discussion. And for the discussion, we have excellent panelists. Let me start with President Jorge Carlos de Almeida Fonseca, former President of the Republic of Cabo Verde. He's a member, of course, of the Global Rule of Law Commission, but President Fonseca is not only a former president, he's one of the most prominent professors. And among other things, let me just mention one little thing. He is the father of the transition from the one-party system to a multi-party democracy. And then we're going to have Professor Carlos Feijó, who is a professor at Agostinho Neto University in Angola, member again of the Rule of Law Commission, former Secretary of State, former Vice Minister, one of the most prominent African personalities. And we have also Professor Teresa Violande, who is, among other things, the director for the Global Rule of Law, of the Institute for the Global Rule of Law, and of the regional branch of the European Public Law Organization in Portugal. And I have to reveal to you that Professor Violande is directing the research and the drafts of the reports of the Global Rule of Law Commission, including the one at hand. Last thing, I wanted just to acknowledge the presence among us of Professor Spiridon Floraidis, who is the director of the European Public Law Organization. So, distinguished colleagues and friends, ambassadors, let me now open the floor for this discussion by giving the floor to Professor President Fonseca.
Les ambassadeurs, chers invités, les quelques mots et observations que je formule ici émanent d'un membre de la Global Rule of Law Commission. Et à ce titre, je me considère à tout le moins solidaire et partie prenante du rapport qui est aujourd'hui présenté. Il s'agit d'un rapport que je tiens pour particulièrement instructif, riche en détails, soigneusement élaboré et qui rend compte avec rigueur des réalités vécues sur notre continent africain dans toute leur diversité, sous l'angle de l'affirmation et de l'effectivité de l'état de droit et de la démocratie en tant que système et régime politique, mais également comme un mode de vie. En effet, il va de soi que, du moins dans la conception contemporaine, il ne saurait être question d'un état de droit fondé à dernière analyse sur l'affirmation de l'éminente dignité de la personne humaine en dehors d'un contexte et d'un cadre de démocratie pluraliste. Cela étant, les propos que je tiens à cet instant, à titre de simples observations ou de remarques sommaires, portent également la marque et le ton d'un ancien combattant révolutionnaire pour l'indépendance, particulièrement engagé dans la clandestinité durant sa jeunesse, dès l'âge de 17-18 ans, qui par la suite, définitivement acquis à la démocratie, a lutté pour la liberté et la démocratisation de son pays. Aspiration heureusement concrétisée, respectivement en 1975 et en 1991. Des observations émanant de quelqu'un qui, au terme d'un parcours de plusieurs décennies, riche et multifacetté, marqué notamment par des ruptures, des dissensions et des privations personnelles de diverses natures, a finalement accédé à la fonction du chef de l'État de son pays, Cabo Verde, pendant 10 années, des mandats successifs de 5 ans, toujours investi d'un véritable cahier de charges, lequel s'est traduit par la promotion et la défense d'une constitution, celle de 1992, fondatrice de l'état de droit et de la démocratie au Cap-Vert, par la garantie d'un régime fondé sur les libertés, ainsi que pour l'édification d'un pays juste, engagé dans un processus continu de développement politique, économique, social et culturel. Aujourd'hui, cet ancien président de la République, mais demeurant avec simplicité un jardinier de la liberté et un pèlerin de la démocratie. De manière presque télégraphique, compte tenu du peu de temps en partie, il me fait de formuler les observations et considérations suivantes en relation avec le rapport sur l'Afrique qui fait ici l'objet de présentation. En Afrique, à mon avis, les tensions entre espoir et désenchantement sont particulièrement manifestes. Le continent a oscillé de manière récurrente entre l'enthousiasme d'une renaissance et les désillusions engendrées par des coups d'État, l'instabilité politique institutionnelle, ainsi que l'absence de progrès en matière de bien-être des populations sous des régimes autocratiques. À la lumière d'approches essentiellement fondées sur des facteurs que l'on pourrait qualifier d'économiques et surtout culturels, la possibilité d'un enracinement durable de la démocratie en Afrique est remise en question, voire parfois même écartée par des autres. Rompre avec l'ensemble des forces endogènes et exogènes qui perpétuent la dépendance et le sous-développement impliquera ainsi avant tout de rompre avec ce que j'ai qualifié d'une sorte de cercle vicieux sur lequel l'Afrique ne connaîtrait pas de véritable développement faute de paix. La démocratie ne s'y enracinerait pas en raison de son incompatibilité prétendue avec des traditions culturelles et morales. Des contextes d'intolérance et d'exclusion sociale priveraient les citoyens de la possibilité de construire une société libre et démocratique, et ainsi de suite. Nonobstant la pertinence de telles considérations, nous demeurons fortement convaincus que le développement intégré et harmonieux des sociétés, en particulier des sociétés africaines, ne saurait être envisagé en dehors d'un cadre démocratique. le large consensus aujourd'hui observé à l'échelle mondiale quant à la légitimité et la viabilité de cette forme de vie collective consacre un principe à vocation universaliste, lequel nourrit également le patrimoine culturel de notre communauté humaine. S'il est indéniable que l'héritage du colonialisme et de l'esclavage a profondément marqué l'héritage structurel chez nous, il subsiste néanmoins le risque de tomber dans une déresponsabilisation récurrente, consistant à attribuer aux autres des responsabilités qui sont également d'ordre interne. La nécessité de transformation profonde s'impose dans le cadre d'un processus susceptible de surmonter les résistances dictées par des facteurs complexes, notamment de la part de certaines élites africaines. Comme l'a souligné par exemple Claude Aquier, la démocratisation ne peut être menée par des tiers. Elle doit être construite par les Africains eux-mêmes. Deuxième point, l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine, de même que la vision 2050 de la ECOWAS, de la CEDEAO, qui disent une ECOWAS, une CEDEAO des peuples avec paix et prospérité pour tous. Fin de citation. C'est mettre en avant le développement économique et social. Toutefois, en absence de stabilité politique, d'institutions crédibles et de limites constitutionnelles clairement définies, ce progrès demeurera difficile à concrétiser. Le cycle des coups d'État militaires, du conflit ethnique, du radicalisme religieux et des régimes de pouvoir personnel continue de compromettre l'avenir. La lutte contre la corruption, la mise en place de leadership fort et crédible, doté d'une légitimité démocratique, ainsi que le renforcement des sociétés civiles, constituent, à mon avis, des impératifs incontournables. La démocratie africaine ne doit pas être appréhendée uniquement comme une technique de gouvernement, mais comme une culture politique. En Afrique, je pense qu'elle sera sans doute un processus demandant de la patience, un processus lent, avec des progrès et des reculs, d'assimilation de comportements et des références apparemment contradictoires. Un processus dans lequel sera toujours discutée l'idée d'une espèce de concordance pratique entre la modernité et la tradition, entre les exigences du développement économique et le combat contre l'exclusion et les inégalités sociales, entre la liberté et les tentations de son conditionnement, entre l'arithmétique des technocraties et l'exigence du salut collectif et de la solidarité sociale, entre le politique et le culturel, entre le réalisme et les préjugés, les représentations collectives, voire les appareils de la symbologie identitaire, très ancrés, les appareils politiques, historiques, sociaux et culturels. Je pense que chaque société africaine tracera son propre chemin démocratique, pour autant qu'il soit enraciné dans la participation citoyenne et dans le respect des droits fondamentaux. Nous souscrivons à l'idée selon laquelle le concept d'état de droit, de rule of law, à l'instar de celui de la démocratie, notamment dans la perspective qui sous-tend l'existence même de notre organisation, Global Rule of Law Commission, peut et doit faire preuve de flexibilité en vue de son adaptation à des contextes géographiques, historiques et culturels différenciés. Toutefois, cette flexibilité ne saurait aller jusqu'à conduire à l'inexistence de l'un quelconque de ces piliers constitutifs et essentiels. Une telle dérive équivaudrait à un véritable tromperie sur l'étiquetage. C'est pas en français. En portugais, nous disons burla d'étiquetas. Tromperie sur l'étiquetage, oui. Selon une expression couramment employée pour les pénalistes, les spécialistes du droit pénal, nous faisons notre idée, selon laquelle l'Afrique a besoin de leadership fort et crédible. Oui, je suis d'accord, parce que de ses principes et de ses valeurs essentielles, consacrées par voie consensuelle à travers une constitution légitimité par la communauté des citoyens. Dans ce parcours, la société civile a joué et continuera de jouer un rôle central. Les étudiants, les journalistes, les avocats, les enseignants, les mouvements sociaux, les femmes et les organisations de défense des droits de l'homme ont été à maintes reprises les moteurs des transformations politiques et de la résistance aux tentations autoritaires. Ce sont ces acteurs qui garantissent que la démocratie ne se limite pas aux institutions, mais qu'elle soit vécue comme une pratique sociale quotidienne et le rôle de plus en plus actif des élites africaines de retour dans leur pays d'origine et l'affirmation progressive de société civile. La démocratie est un processus toujours inachevé. Les expériences menées dans des pays appelés du Nord nous l'ont démontré. La démocratie est née de la société, et dans la société, pas dans l'État. Mais aussi pour cette raison qu'il n'y aura pas un seul processus ou un seul modèle, mais probablement plusieurs modèles. Nous sommes également convaincus que la démocratie sera possible si on abandonne des positions extrêmes du type culturaliste ou historiciste qui veut une révolution et rejette la critique des valeurs et des traditions et refuse tout mimétisme culturel. La principale et la plus dangereuse illusion à déconstruire, à mon avis, c'est celle selon laquelle la paix et la sécurité, ainsi que le développement en Afrique, pourraient être assurés par des régimes autoritaires ou dictatoriaux. L'histoire a démontré à maintes reprises, y compris à la lumière de notre propre expérience, que les autocraties ne garantissent pas une stabilité durable, mais ne font que différer les conflits, accentuer les inégalités et perpétuer les cycles de violence. La véritable stabilité procède des sociétés libres, pluralistes et dotées d'institutions solides. Rien que dans notre sous-région africaine, les coups d'État et le régime militaire au Mali, au Burkina Faso, au Niger, en Guinée-Bissau en témoignent. Et je termine. La démocratie n'est pas un point d'arrivée, mais un processus de construction permanent. Comme le rappelait Onésime Silveira, un intellectuel capverdien, la démocratisation des pays africains doit être appréhendée comme un instrument de modernisation et non comme une simple option politique. C'est une voie exigeante, parfois longue, mais irremplaçable. En définitive, cultiver la démocratie en Afrique signifie croire que des sociétés composées de femmes et d'hommes libres constituent la meilleure garantie de développement, de justice et de dignité pour tous. Le présent rapport, mesdames, messieurs, substantiel et riche, devrait pouvoir être diffusé et débattu dans nos pays africains, dans le cadre des institutions d'organisations représentatives, et surtout au sein des sociétés civiles, des barreaux, des professionnels des médias, des acteurs de la justice, des milieux universitaires, des organisations de jeunesse et de femmes, des parlementaires et des intellectuels. Un texte nourri de convictions, certes, mais également un texte définitivement ouvert. Merci.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Andreas, to give me the word, the floor. The youngest population in the world. The landscape shaped by ancient civilizations, by Roman, Byzantine, Islamic incursions, by European colonialism, post-colonial strife for self-determination, of course, because of this, Africa offered perhaps the most complex case state in legal pluralism that any continent ever presented. So our report does not pretend to be exhaustive. And I would say that we select 5 or 6 points to discuss. I would say indicators of the rule of law in Africa. One, separation of powers, access to justice, independence of judiciary, accountability, legal certainty, and of course we did not discuss the sixth indicator, which is the protection of fundamental rights. Because for us, it runs transversally through all the others indicators that I said before. So the context, the foundation of Africa has been described by President Fonseca. But the feature of African legal landscape deserve particular emphasis, at least 2. First, judicial pluralism. 33 of 54 African constitutions formally recognize customary law in some form, normally in their constitution. Angola is one of these countries. It is recognized by the constitutional law, customary law. Second, the prominence of collective rights articulated in the Africa Charter on human and people rights alongside the Western liberal tradition of individual rights. Third, the centrality of religions that from Christianism and Islam, but also, do not forget it, indigenous spiritual traditions. All this is shaping legal and political institutions in Africa. As President Fonseca said, the institutional framework in Africa, from operating 3 levels, supranational level, African Union, through instruments such as the African Charter on Women and People Rights, the Banjul Charter, African Charter on Democracy, Election and Governance, has constructed a continental normative architecture of remarkable ambition. Sub-regional level organizations such as ECOWAS, SADC, etc. And at the international level, the United States system and the International Criminal Court complement all this architecture. Our report, I would say, the 5 seminal matters are separation of powers. We in Africa did. We identify the lasting influence of 2 colonial models Anglo-American island in Anglophone Africa, French 50 Republican model in Francophone countries, Lusophony and Hispanic model as well. And it shows that we have different models in Africa. On access to justice, the report has been built around three key questions: accessibility, effectiveness, efficiency, or alternative dispute resolution. And the report identifies as well 10 major challenges we have to face, and the conflict arising from legal pluralism as well. The report, regardless, documents impressive innovation, mobile court in Kenya and Chad, the abusive mediation system in Rwanda, the community advice office in South Africa, and the digital justice platform spanning across the planet. On independence of judiciary, the report acknowledged substantial progress, including the recent appointment by African Union of a focal point for judicial independence. So, this is, I will not repeat what Professor Amatu explained, but I will focus on some, I would say, critical observations for our analysis. I have 3 or 4, 5 remarks to discuss. So, one is the risk of normative dependence on exogenous models. What I mean with that? So, I think African countries have to start seeing how rule of law, how we will measure benchmark of liberal constitutionalism against our traditions, against our African convictions. I do not for one moment suggest that those benchmarks are wrong. I suggest that they are incomplete. I think we must think about the rule of law based on our cultural, based on our real situation. I think the need of a deeper engagement with legal pluralism. Of course, the report identified legal pluralism as one of the most distinctive features of the African legal landscape. The report treats as well the customary law and the religion legal system. But, in my view, we have to
Professor, may I ask a bit to accelerate?
Yes, I'm going to finalize my. So, maybe to finalize is something for me important. How we can Africanize democracy rather than democratizing Africa. The report posed almost in passing the philosophical question whether Western-style liberal democracy truly fits Africa's communal tradition. But this is a thing that we have to still reflect with. And the colonial legal legacy and the question of decolonization. I think the report acknowledged it, but we have to discuss more about how this decolonization process should be speeded in Africa. Finally, the award on collective rights. The African Charter on Human and People Rights is unique among international human rights instruments because if you take a look at, indeed, the African Union Charter on Human and People Rights is based on one principles that move all the Africans, and I should describe in one word. We, as an African, we are a collective people and never are individual people. We prefer the collectivity rather than the individualities. The individualities, for me, is something that is founding for Western democracy, but instead, we in Africa, I think, we start thinking collectively rather than individually, and it makes a difference. Thank you very much.
I thank Professor Feggio. I now give the floor to Ms. Teresa Violande.
Is to draw your attention to one analytical thread in this report, that it's not visible per se as an analytical thread, but I think it deserves this reading. So it's two phenomena that deserve to be read together rather than separately. The first phenomenon has to do, and it has already been highlighted, with the depth of normative development that the African continent has achieved with regards to rule of law and democracy over the last 3 decades. The Eventual Charter, the Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, the case law of the African Court of Human Rights, the very progressive interpretation and expansion of the regional economic communities into the protection of human rights and constitutional governance. Taken together, these acquis, this normative acquis, constitute a continental architecture for the rule of law that, in normative terms, is among the most sophisticated of any region. And the report documents this carefully and, may I say, rightly does so. The second phenomenon has to do with the difficulty in putting words into actions, the difficulty that this architecture currently faces in translating the normative commitments into political practice. The report records that compliance with the rulings of the African court stands at around 7% in full nowadays, with non-compliance very high. Some states have withdrawn the declaration, as President Amata has already highlighted, that allows individual access and NGOs to bring cases before the court. The recent fracture with ECOWAS, the several attempts at unconstitutional change of government since 2020. And these two phenomena are documented in the report. And so I would suggest that the main challenge facing rule of law on the continent today is not a deficit of norms. That deficit has already been addressed in the last 3 decades, but a deficit of execution and of sustained political adherence to frameworks. The institutional architecture exists, but the friction lies in the willingness of states to bind themselves effectively to it. And this reading has implications for what international engagement with African rule of law should look like. The most, I would add, the most useful contribution that the international community can make is not to propose new normative frameworks, of which there is no shortage, but to support the existing ones by reinforcing the regional courts that adjudicate them, by accompanying states that genuinely seek to comply with them, and by making non-compliance more politically costly than it currently is. It also suggests, and here I draw a bridge respectfully with the Secretary General Morati's address, that the gap between normative commitment and political execution, unfortunately, is not a phenomenon exclusive to Africa. It echoes in the diagnosis that the Commission has made with regards to other regions, including those regions that pride themselves of being consolidated portrays of the rule of law. So really, there is no dichotomy between jungle and garden, and I respectfully refer to that and reinforce that conclusion that the Commission has already drawn out in light of its previous reports. So the report that we had the honor of presenting here today is the product of a commission that takes seriously its founding mandate to develop a global concept of rule of law through a dialogue of civilizations in respect of universal values and of the diversity and equal worth of legal cultures. The Institute, which is its operational arm, stands ready to work with states, with international organizations, and with civil society actors whenever you find useful to do so. So we extend that invitation explicitly to the missions present in this room and to the United Nations systems represented here today. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Violante. And now we have a few minutes for some questions.
So before we presented, presented the report on Africa, we did the same for Europe, the same for Northern America. This is the third report, and but this is the more mature report because of our work, which has been developed. And so the first is the little message that I want to present to you. The second is I want to thank the sponsor countries, all those who joined us today and to organize this event. We are very grateful to each one of you.
Georgia, an old friend of mine, and his country is in the vanguard of the work of our organization. So, and I would like now to give the floor to Ambassador Papadatos because... oh, okay, so sorry, you are too close, so I didn't see you.
No, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Mine is just an expression of gratitude for the event, well organized, which brought together very powerful speakers. So I want to really thank all of them, President Fonseca, our President in Mozambique as well. We have very good and fruitful relations between the two countries. I couldn't agree more that we need a society, a rules-based society. I mean, I can't imagine a world without rules. Even with the existing rules in the international community, we still have a lot of conflicts, we still have a lot of problems in the relations between states and organizations. So I cannot imagine a world without rules. So this is just to express my support to the main conclusion, which is that international law is alive. International law should continue alive for centuries to come, even when we have tendencies of the philosophy in some of the countries that we all know. It's not important to mention them, but we can defend the multilateral system. I think defending the multilateral system is one way of defending international public law. So I basically want to say thank you very much for the interventions that have been very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I now give the floor to Ambassador Papadatos.
Yes, since nobody asked a question, I have the reputation, as some people know in this room, of asking difficult questions. So my question is whether the rule of law can exist in non-democratic, autocratic societies. Thank you.
Perhaps
I give the floor to any member. I just want to say that, you know, in totalitarian systems, autocratic systems, there is always respect for the letter of the law. What is the letter is another story, but this is not rule of law. So I give the floor probably to
No, but
President Amato.
it's, I never know which one. Does it work?
Yes, now, yes. Yes.
No, here in our jargon, we distinguish between rule of law and rule by law. Generally, nowadays, also authoritarian, totalitarian states comply with the rule by law in the sense that they make the laws and they comply with them. And if they are not satisfied, they change the laws again. Now, this is not the rule of law. The rule of law is based on an essential concept that there is a higher law, higher than any human and therefore also state power. And they have to respect the limits that come from the higher law. And also there has to be somebody who is the voice of the higher law. Generally, it goes to the judiciary, if not the judiciary, generally a constitutional court. In Mozambique, they have a wonderful constitutional court. And a wonderful friend of mine, member of this commission, Lucia, who is the president of the court, here the system of the rule of law is complete. The law is the higher one, and there is the voice of the higher law. Of course, the rate of rule of law and of democracy can be measured in terms of compliance. Sometimes you have the rule of law, you have the system to comply with it, but eventually there is no compliance. At that point you have a problem. But basically, be ready to understand the difference between rule of law and rule by law.
You know, this brings us back to ancient Greece. Some of you remember the story of the naval battle of Arginuses, where the generals were not able, because of bad weather, to collect the wounded and the dead, etc. So in the demos of Athens at the time, there was question that we should arrest and execute all the generals because they didn't do their job. And Socrates was the only one to revolt and to say that, you know, we cannot do this. This is unfair. And the reaction was, yes, but we are the ones that fix the laws. So if the laws do not allow it, we're going to change them. And if you, Socrates, you don't agree, we're going to execute you too. And eventually, this is what they did. They executed the generals. But this is how the Athenian democracy came to an end. So we need to bear in mind this. His Excellency, the Ambassador of Italy, wants to say something.
Thanks for the interventions. As you know, Italy is a founder of EPLO and a strong supporter of it. And we appreciate very much the way the Commission managed to analyze and understand and also the complexity of African history, the context, and the specificities, as well as some indicators have been put forward on measuring the rule of on separation of powers, access to justice, corruption, human rights, and so on. In due time, the possible measures that EPLO can offer us and African countries to approach.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I give the floor to Professor Fejo.
Thank you very much to give me the floor. It is a simple question that we are always discussing in Africa. So, responding to your question, rule of law and democracy. So when we teach constitutional law, normally we divide between formal rule of law and material rule of law. Formal rule of law means that your constitution will include rule of law, but in practices you are not living under the rule of law. This is rule by the law. That's why we have to add when we rule of law and democracy. This is the way that we have to explain the content of rule of law, which include democracy. Of course, it will be possible rule of law without democracy, but the rule of law without democracy is limited, fragile, is not in material terms rule of law indeed. We have to make this difference just to be clear that even your constitution include rule of law as a simple material term, maybe if your judiciary is not independent, etc., means that from material point of view is not rule of law indeed. Thank you.
I thank Professor Fejo. I give the floor to Undersecretary General Miguel Angel Moratinos, and then Professor Papadatos will say something and then finalize our session.
Very briefly, I think on this concept of democracy, rule of law, have to be owned by everybody. The point that we hear very interesting intervention of the Angola friend, he said we have to Africanize democracy and not to democratize Africa. I will agree with him. And that is the challenge of EPO. We should come to the main element that everybody consider that the rule of law is not only a Western European product that is sold or imposed by our high-level civilizational wisdom as Europeans. No, there is a lot of common ground. I mean, corruption. I mean, you name it.
Corruption.
We know these things.
So it would not be, of course, rule of law is not rule by law. No, as Professor D'Amato said. And even in an authoritarian, totalitarian country, we can debate, we can engage with them in order to establish a certain respect of rule of law, in order that maybe in the meantime they will move from authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. So that is the magic of this European Public Law Commission organization. You have a tremendous task, because you are the only one who are taking care of that. Of course, the Africans say, no, I don't need that some come. But they need to contrast the point of view with you, and with Latin America, and with Asia. That's the reason we are here now. Civilization, what is civilization? Like Spengler or Toynbee, that said that the Western, we are the last civilization, and that we came to the top, and the rest are not contributing, or we're in a different status. That everybody have to contribute with something. I mean, the Chinese, for instance, you can control, authoritarian, whatever you want. But behind them, way to behave, organize, they have something that could be useful. So I think that is your mandate. You are only starting. But it is true, rule of law. We have to identify 4, 5, 7 areas that everybody agreed. So in 1948, you have Eleanor Roosevelt, I don't know, a new lady, Llorente, he will be the lady, to draft the new element of rule of law. 30 articles of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even today they are, I don't think that somebody can criticize one article of the 30. Not the Chinese, not the African, not Latin American. But they are protesting, they saying that I didn't draft them. They imposed to us. And so they are a bit suspicious because they say that it was Eleanor Roosevelt, American lady. So, no, we have to draft the new elements of rule of law. But all together, not coming from Brussels or from Washington or from Beijing, no, all together, taking, the added value of each of us.
Thank you, Undersecretary Moratinos. The only thing I want to say is, John Lennon, imagine, I hope one day you will join us and the world will be as one. So I give the floor to Ambassador Papadatos for to say something and then conclude the meeting. Thank you, Professor.
Very briefly, I have a confession to make. The reason I asked that particular question about democracy and rule of law is because I posed the question to artificial intelligence sites, and I did not get a satisfactory answer. I got very descriptive ones, but they were not as clear as the ones that were given by the professors here. Thank you.
Okay. So, Excellencies and distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I thank all the participants, all the people that took the floor. It was a great honor and a pleasure to have you all with us today. I want to hope that this is a first, but there will be many other meetings that will follow, and we hope that this debate we are engaging upon with the African continent will be fruitful and will continue. Thank you very much. Have a very nice afternoon.